What is the strangest coincidence you have experienced? Part 4. A few years ago, I had a flight from London, Luton, back to my country. While waiting in line, I noticed my uncle whom I hadn't seen in over 10 years. I spoke to him, but he didn't recognize me, so I explained everything, and we laughed about what a nice coincidence it was. Later, we discovered that we had seats together. Once I visited my mom, but I got a call and had to quickly return to another city where I work. I found out the only available way back was on a train at 2 a.m. When I arrived at a platform, I noticed there was a girl I was seeing at the time. I didn't know she was also in town. She wasn't alone but with a guy. I think it's pretty obvious what that meant. Then, when the train arrived, we ended up sitting together because that's how the seating system assigned us. I did a first exchange program, met a girl in my high school. For years later I did another exchange. This time I went to Berlin and ran into this girl again at her school. In the 80s, my sister boarded a flight in California that only flew within the state. We grew up in New York. She had lost touch with her childhood best friend years ago, and that was one of the conversation topics with her seatmate on the flight. She mentioned her friend's name. The seatmate talked about his downstairs neighbor in the apartment building where he lived, who had the same name. Turns out, the neighbor was my sister's childhood best friend. Twice a week, someone has commented to me that they're having a really unlucky day. Each time, something bad has happened immediately. The first time was the taxi driver I was with, who had just finished the sentence when a driver coming from the opposite direction crashed into us. The second was the dentist this morning, who stumbled when he started to lean over me and pricked my gum. There were no serious injuries on either occasion, but it feels like some Final Destination type silliness is happening. A school friend and I were backpacking separately through Southeast Asia, British. He walked into a bar I was sitting in Jakarta. I had a car accident many years ago in a city far from home. Many of these stories seem to start with a car accident. Anyway, I was sitting in the restaurant in the small town waiting for a tow truck. My parents, who were also on vacation but not with me, walked in. Both of us seemed not to understand why the other was there, and we wondered if we had made plans to meet in a city neither of us was heading to, or if we knew someone there. Also, once on a work trip over 1,000 miles from home, I pointed out a guy in a restaurant. I told my wife, "Hey, that looks a lot like Steve." It turned out to be Steve, a guy who worked on the same floor as me in the same office. I was friends with Chris in high school. I haven't seen him since the day we graduated in 1993. Last week I saw his dad every day for 5 days straight. Usually in his car, but in different local towns, at different times of day, and once from my office window as he was turning in the parking lot. The next day, I decided on one checkout line over another for no real reason at the supermarket. I ended up right behind Chris's dad. At that point, I had to reintroduce myself and mention that I had seen him every day for almost the past week. I think I startled him. I was driving from Wyoming to Oregon passing through Montana. This was in the late 90s. I drove up to a national forest to find a place to sleep. The next morning, I came down from the mountain where I had slept and arrived at a campground. I was thirsty because I had drunk all of mine the night before. The radio was on, and Bob Dylan was singing. I saw a hand pump on a pedestal and headed towards it. Just as I arrived, Bob was singing "The Pump Don't Work 'Cause the Vandals Took the Handles." The handle was missing. I was working at a river restoration site in Oregon where an EPA employee based in Oklahoma was conducting a multi-year project on groundwater flow. On his last day at the site, we got some beers to celebrate the end of his project. We started talking about our hometowns, and it turned out we were both from the same home state. When he mentioned the name of his hometown, I mentioned the name of his high school mascot. He looked at me for a minute and said, "Wow, you look like my last name." He was friends with my father and uncles in high school and immediately recognized me as one of them. Incredible. I travel a lot for work. I had a book on my Amazon list for a couple of years. Not sure why I never bought it. One day I finally decided to buy it. I carried it in my backpack for another 2 months. One day I'm sitting in my van, which is my office, and I finally decide to open it. I start reading, and just a few pages and the author mentions where he's from, which is the state I'm currently in. That's interesting. A few pages later he mentions his hometown. I'm currently 1 mile north of it. At this point, I'm feeling a little weird about the whole thing. I look around almost to see if I'm in a dream. I look at the road sign which is about 30 feet behind me. The road is named after the author. I'm not a religious or spiritual person at all. I would probably say I'm almost atheist. The experience really threw me for a loop. The phenomenon is called synchronicity, and it's very strange to experience. I worked in a big department store in Calgary in the 80s. I had booked a vacation to visit a friend in a distant city, Vancouver, so I was having lunch at a restaurant in Vancouver and I run into one of my coworkers. I didn't even know she was on vacation at the same time as me, let alone that she would be in the same city. This one is much crazier. As my new girlfriend was busy doing something else, I went to a backyard barbecue at a friend's alone. I was casually chatting with a young woman at the party. During the conversation, we discovered that we shared exactly the same birth date, down to the year. Additionally, it turns out she was from a small remote town, about 40 miles away from the equally small town where I'm from, and we both were born on the same day in the same hospital in another small town that was approximately the same distance from our hometowns. Furthermore, a couple of days later, I finally met my new girlfriend's roommate for the first time, and guess what? The same woman.
I picked a name off a phone list for a business consultation. When I got there, he tells me his best friend is also Asian, and I say, "Oh, that's nice." Without me asking, he drops the name of his best friend, and guess what? I know the person, and used to party with him.
I'm not sure if this counts. My father died in a car accident, in which my mother survived, when I was 4 years old. I don't have many memories of the aftermath. At that time, I lived in the farthest part of Canada. 17 years later, I'm working in Western Canada, far from home, when I meet a new employee who was from my hometown. Turns out she was my next-door neighbor at the time of my father's death. She told me that on the night of the accident, her family received a phone call asking them to look after me and my 4 older siblings until other help arrived. What a coincidence.
One of my closest friends was visiting on a work trip with her boss. Both of them were from my hometown. We decided to meet up at a bar. My friend brought her boss, whom I had never met, and I brought another old friend who had recently moved to my city from the same hometown. When the 4 of us arrived at the bar, the boss and the newly moved friend were saying, "You, what are you doing here? How do you know?" Turns out the boss was childhood friends with the newly moved friend. We're not from a small town, nor do we live in the same areas. Our metropolitan area has over 1 million people, so it was a strange coincidence that we were all connected.
I live in Hawaii and was attending university. That summer I flew to San Francisco to visit my friend. I commented that the trendy food truck lot we were visiting seemed like one of those hipster places my college professor would go to. 5 minutes later, we bump into that professor. He's not even from San Francisco, he's from Portland. I felt like I had summoned/manifested/conjured him from 2,000 miles away. My grandparents separated when my mom was about 5 years old. My grandfather kept in touch for a few years and then there was no contact after that. I've never met him and only saw a picture of him recently. My mom had always wanted to know what had happened to him, so over the years, I've tried to track him down. I look for death records, even in other states of Australia, from time to time, 30-year privacy search restrictions. In 2015, I finally found what I thought was a death certificate for him. I requested the certificate, which I received on January 10, 2015. His date of death was January 10, 1985, exactly 30 years later. I went to Ecuador for my 31st birthday. I was staying at sea level in Guayaquil but decided to take a short 2-night trip to Cuenca, which is 2.5 kilometers above sea level. Taking a bus to the Andes, having a great first night in the city, going to bed feeling fine. The next day, I wake up and I'm not feeling well, really. Turns out I am really susceptible to altitude sickness. It was worse than any hangover I've ever had, and I've had quite a few. I was so sick that I had to rest for 20 minutes after struggling to put on a single sock. Terrible, terrible. So by mid-morning, I dragged my poor body out of the hotel because this is my only full day in this beautiful city. I find a nice cafe and sit down trying not to literally vomit into my café con leche, so sick and dizzy I feel near death. There's another white person sitting at the table next to me. He sees me using all my energy trying not to vomit. He says he used to get terribly sick with altitude when he first started living in Cuenca, but then he started using the traditional method of chewing coca leaves and it really helps, so he suggested I do that. I was willing in theory, but at that moment I was actively trying to get a job with the US government and they're infamous for being intolerant even with moderate use of recreational drugs. So I thanked him for the advice, but I wasn't going to be doing cocaine for my upset stomach like we're in 1885 here. Fast forward a year and a half later, I finally got a job in the government, which requires me to move from one end of the North American continent to somewhere vaguely in the middle. So I pack all my things into the car, put my cat in her carrier on the passenger seat and drive. I decide to spend a month or so living in different Airbnb rooms for a week each, so I can work at my new job during the week and apartment hunt on the weekends. The last place I stayed, the owner was renting out the 3 spare rooms in his house to Airbnb guests. I really liked the host. He made his own PVC didgeridoos and was just generally cool. We started talking about this and that, and eventually the conversation turns to travels, so I tell him about my last big trip, for my 31st birthday, to Ecuador. "Oh, the guy in the other room lives in Ecuador," says the host. And then the guy walks into the living room where we're hanging out, and it's Mr. Coco leaves for upset stomach from 18 months ago. Apparently, he spends half the year living in Cuenca and the other half of the year living in Airbnb rooms while visiting relatives in the middle of North America. And we both just happened to rent rooms in the same house for the same week, and we reunited in a much less exotic but also less nauseating situation after a very brief but memorable conversation in a cafe nearly 4,000 miles away. And well, friends, that was all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, let me know with a thumbs up so that YouTube can share these stories with more people. Remember to hit the bell icon to be the first to know when we upload a new video. See you next time.